Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Attorney General Garland, for appearing here today in a timely manner and responding to our questions, as well as for your efforts to be responsive to the issues facing America today. Thank you. I want to address two primary areas in my limited time: attacks on elected officials and attacks on elections. Several of my colleagues have pointed out the far right's lies about election integrity have led to intimidation and threats of violence and death being made against elected officials and their families. In Pennsylvania, we saw armed extremists come across state lines to try to disrupt the counting of votes in Philadelphia, and an election commissioner had to put his children in hiding after death threats were made against him and his family. With the reopening of schools this fall, we've now seen similar criminal conduct being directed at teachers and school board members with the encouragement of far-right extremists, including some elected officials. I take this personally because I was a school board for 10 years, almost a decade, until 2015, and during that time I had thousands of hours of conversations with involved parents and constituents in grocery stores, on baseball fields, and in courtrooms and school board meetings. Sometimes the discussions were passionate, but everyone always respected the boundaries of protected speech, and those exchanges of opinions and information were always conducted with the goal of exchanging information, reaching solutions for the community. We never, ever experienced any threats to the personal safety of board members, educators, or their families, and that has changed. The personal and physical attacks that have been directed against school leaders in recent months have crossed well over the line of protected free speech or parental involvement and have become criminal conduct. And that's what we're talking about here. As you noted, parents have a right to be heard and to complain and to argue, but parents and outside agitators do not have the right to criminally harass or threaten or assault school leaders and their families. We've heard some of the incidents that have occurred elsewhere around the country. In my district, police had to be called to several meetings after agitators disrupted the meetings. And elsewhere in Pennsylvania, a candidate for office urged community members at a public rally to, and I quote, "Forget going into school boards with freaking data. You go into those school boards to remove them. I'm going in with 20 strong men, and I'm going to give them an option. They can leave or they can be removed." I mean, that's not ordinary speech. I mean, it's the type of conduct that has led school boards and school officials to request help from law enforcement. It's shocking, but perhaps not surprising that some of our colleagues have tried to frame these criminal acts as free speech by involved parents. It appears to be part of a pattern by far-right politicians of fanning the flames of chaos and turning a blind eye to domestic extremism and violence. The conduct that terrorizes educators now across the country is no more like that of ordinary parents showing up at school board meetings than the conduct of the violent mob that showed up at the Capitol on January 6th was that of ordinary tourists. I think there's a profound distinction here and one that warrants the attention of law enforcement. Would you agree that allowing threats of violence and intimidation against elected officials to go unreported or unpunished could not only lead to greater violence against elected officials, but also contribute to an atmosphere that's harmful to free speech and the free exchange of ideas?
Yes, I do agree.
Okay. Moving on to attacks on elections. For almost 2 years, the former president and his supporters have attacked and spread lies about election security in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Almost a year after President Biden's victory, attacks on Pennsylvania elections occur today. Last month, Republican members of the PA legislature launched another attack on Pennsylvania voters. They sent a subpoena to the Pennsylvania Department of State, demanding that the state turn over the 2020 voting records of every voter in the state, along with their driver's licenses and their social security numbers, so that information could be turned over to an unidentified private contractor. Pennsylvania voters of every party and independents were outraged about this invasion of privacy and the possibility that sensitive personal information was being put at risk. Can you address how this kind of sweeping intrusion into election and personal data under the guise of an election audit might violate federal election laws?
Yes, I can't. Let me just say on the previous point that you made, although I gave you a quick answer, the full answer is we have an election threats task force, and we've had that for quite some time. I've met with the National Association of Election Administrators. and the National Association of Secretaries of State for every state, and that's what prompted us to establish this task force. Now, on the second question, I don't want to discuss any particular circumstance, and certainly not that one, but there are provisions of the Voting Rights Act that require state election officials to keep custody of voting records and voting equipment and materials relating to the last election, I think for 18 months. And similarly, there are provisions of the same statute which prohibit intimidation of, or acts leading to the intimidation of voters, both of which are sort of the core of the federal government's concern with respect to post-election audits.
Thank you.
Gentlelady's time has expired.